In this video, we're going to talk about the essence of Confucianism. Confucianism was the dominant ancient Chinese philosophy from the Han Dynasty up until the revolution in the early 20th century, and it has so thoroughly and fundamentally shaped not just Chinese, but Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese cultures that it still is the fundamental ethos for this entire part of the globe today. So we're going to take a look at the basic principles of Confucianism as well as the circumstances of its founding, and this will prepare us for our later major massive video on the Han Dynasty. Let's get started. So if we look here, you can see a cat, right? This is a painting from the 9th century by an ancient Tang Dynasty artist. And this cat is playful, right? It's pouncing. You can see that it's got a certain color scheme, black and white color scheme. It's got one leg that is colored and other legs that are not. It's got color on its tail. It's got this little V shape, upside down V shape on its head, right? So this artist in the 9th century was painting a cat in a form that would be recognizable to and appreciated by aristocrats of the Tang Dynasty. But when we switch to this modern painting of a cat from the 1920s, we see a very similar layout. You can see the same and gray color scheme. You can see that the tail is colored. You can see that there's coloration on just one leg. You can see that there's dark coloration on the back, and on the front of the cat, it's white. You can also see that there's black coloration on top of the cat's head, along with an upside down V or U shape. So we're looking at two cats separated by 1,100 years, more than that, but well, probably close to that, 1,100 years. And yet they have the same essential characteristics, the same color pattern. They're even in the same kind of pouncing pose, right? So this artist from the 20th century was following the same norms regarding how to paint a cat as this artist from the 9th century. Now, I just want to take a second to show you some Western paintings from some Western art from the same period of time in the West. We would call it the early medieval period and the 20th century. So if we look at this French manuscript, this is actually from the 11th century, the image of the crucifixion, a very popular subject matter for the time period. Just take a look at how the people involved are portrayed, how the body of Christ is portrayed, the cross itself, right? And now let's take a look at the same subject matter painted by Salvador Dali in the early 20th century. So if you take a look at this surrealist crucifixion by Dali, you'll see that it is very different from its medieval predecessor. There's even a throwback in the picture while it is showing St. John kneeling at the cross, right? But it still is, even with this throwback in it, it's very different. The whole use of perspective and shapes, everything is fundamentally very different. And when you compare the two cats that I showed earlier, if you want to rewind and take a look at those, you'll come to a very significant conclusion. And that is that East Asian societies, Monsoon Asia in general, is much more conservative than the West. I had a bit of a break there in the recording. Hopefully it didn't mess up. But anyway, so Western society is from an East Asian perspective, always in a state of flux, right? It's almost chaotic. Right? There isn't the attempt to find established forms and stick to them in the long haul, right? Which is something that in monsoon Asia is deeply valued, and this is certainly part of Confucianism. Confucianism is looking at the past for inspiration, not towards the future. And this is something that affected Chinese thinking in the 19th century and 20th centuries and caused a great amount of cultural inertia that led to a lot of suffering. Today, the government of China has found a balance between respecting its traditions and looking at its past and planning for the future. For example, space exploration, scientific innovation, etc. But for most of Chinese history, the emphasis has been on antiquity, looking into the distant past. So we talked about the Zhou dynasty, the Duke of Zhou, how he had helped to establish the Zhou dynasty. And he set in place this concept of the mandate of heaven. Well, for Confucius, the founder of Confucianism, and all subsequent Confucian scholars, he was the ideal ruler. He ruled in place of his nephew, who was a child, and he ruled as a regent. And he didn't attempt to take power fully, permanently, but he ruled the land wisely and strengthened the monarchy until his nephew could take over. This is because of his devotion to his older brother. He was very pious. He had a lot of what we call filial piety, which we'll talk more about in a moment. But he was considered the ideal ruler. And subsequent dynasties have looked back to this figure, and from Confucius onward, they have idealized this man, and as well as the great kings of the Xia dynasty, the great kings of the Shang dynasty, the ones who had reigned before corruption had set in. And they attempted to emulate these great men of old in their future governments, right? They were not looking towards progress the way that the West does. The West looks forward in time. This largely philosophically stems from Christianity, where time is moving forward. You have the creation of the world, the fall of man, the birth of Christ, crucifixion, resurrection, and then the second coming. Christianity is moving forward in time. Confucianism looks backwards. So now that we've established kind of the general tenor of Confucianism, let's talk about its founder, Confucius, who lived in the 6th century BC. We Latinize his name as Confucius because many great Chinese philosophers have received these Latin names. This is something that traditionally Europeans did in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries to non-Western philosophers whom they respected. Confucius lived in the Warring States period where the Zhou dynasty was still in power, but it had become extremely weakened, and the Warring States fought amongst themselves. And I talked about in the last lecture about how there were these massed armies of crossbowmen, that warfare had become brutal and cutthroat, that the political system contained a lot of betrayal and chaos, and there was mass death in society. The agricultural system was disrupted. Peasants were being slaughtered by the thousands and thousands. And many of the social thinkers, the philosophers of the so-called 100 schools, wanted to figure out how to get out of this mess. How do we get out of this period of nonstop violence, of warfare and factionalism? I compare it to, in some cities in the United States today, there's a great amount of violence, a great amount of crime, and lots of murders, right? Cities like St. Louis, Chicago. And there are attempts by organizations and city planners and officials to try to move people past this violence. And they're not really successful much of the time. For the 100 schools of philosophy, there was kind of the same concern. How do we stabilize society and stop all of this carnage? And this involved a number of questions. One of those questions was, are human beings innately good or innately evil? Ancient Chinese philosophers believed that if they could solve this problem of the nature of humanity, that they could then figure out a proper solution. The legalists believed people were evil, as I stated in the last lecture, So they had to be governed very, very stringently. The Confucianists believed the opposite. Confucius and his successors believed that human beings were born generally good, that it was corruption and oppression that corrupted human beings. So, if you have the proper upbringing for a child, that child's natural good nature will come to the forefront, right? Confucius did not believe in the innate evil of human beings, and he also was one of the first people in history to believe that virtually any human being, if they're reached early enough, is salvageable. Confucius believed, and this is the fundamental principle of Confucianism, Confucius believed that a human being's behavior, moral behavior in particular, whether they did right or they did wrong, whether they were murderers or whether they were virtuous, depended on their relationship with their elders in their families, right? Particularly their parents. The parent-child relationship defined the human being for Confucius. It wasn't about spirits. It wasn't about an innate evil nature in human beings. Confucius argued that when a human being is a criminal or a murderer or violent, that's because something went wrong in the parent-child interactions during that person's youth. That proper education and upbringing was what was necessary to make people good. So, this is why the Confucianists emphasized education so thoroughly. They didn't just believe that education was a good, they believed that it was necessary for a person's moral development. The more educated you became, the more moral you became, according to the Confucianists. And the way to fix society, the way to fix this period of intensive warfare, was to repair the relationships between parents and their children, right? To have a harmonious household where husband, wife, children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins all came together in unity, respected each other's traditional roles, and obeyed each other, right? Obeyed the norms of traditional Chinese culture. That it was the family being out of whack that led to the kind of misery they were experiencing. And I'll give you an example. King of Wu had, when Confucius was traveling around, he had originally been an official of the state of Lu, and he traveled around to different states to spread his teachings. When he spread to the state of Wu, the king of Wu called him to court. The king of Wu had issued a draft, conscription of all young men under a certain age to join his army because he wanted to go to war. There was a young man who showed up who had been a draft dodger. He had refused to report for conscription. The officials brought him in, and one of the chancellors said, well, this young man should be put to death. He's a coward and a traitor, and he dodged the draft. And the king turned to Confucius and said, well, what would you do with this man? And Confucius asked him, why did you not report for conscription? And the young man said, I have an elderly father whom I take care of. If I have to leave him and join the army, he will die, and I cannot do that. And so the king said, you put your own love for your father above your love for your king and your kingdom? And one of the officials said, that's treason. He should be put to death. And Confucius said, no, don't put this young man to death. Make him a minister in your court and put him in charge of a region. And the king said, what? If I reward this man for dodging the draft, then no one will take me seriously. How are we supposed to win this war if we can't force these young men to join the army? And Confucius said, if all young men were like this young man, we would never have any wars to start with. Meaning that the morals of caring for his elderly father, the morality of that superseded any loyalty to this monarch. Right? The Confucianists generally had a disdain for militarism, a disdain for military expenditures, for expeditions outside of China's borders, and that's still very much part of Chinese thinking. A kind of suspicion of foreign adventures. In some regards, it's very similar to the way that the United States was in the 19th century. Confucius was followed by a scholar named Mencius. Mencius is comparable, he is to Confucianism what St. Paul was to Christianity. Right? St. Paul took the teachings of Christ, systematized them, kind of developed theology from the principles that Christ taught, from the parables that Christ taught. Mencius did the same thing with Confucianism. He took Confucius' various analects, his quotes, and he derived from them principles. And he systematized everything into a consistent philosophy that the government could then use to run society. So his name was Mengzi. So, and like Confucius, he has a Latinized name, but he's very, very in shaping shaping Confucian teaching, and particularly when in regard to the ideas about human nature. So, like Paul, he's very philosophically oriented. He took these teachings and made them digestible and systematized them for future generations. During the Qin dynasty, Confucianists were very heavily persecuted. The legalists regarded them as their principal enemy. They saw them as effeminate, as weak, as wanting society to be weak for war. They believed that the Confucianists put family loyalty above that of loyalty to the state. They argued that Confucianists were very, very poor society. And so, whenever Confucianists were caught by the government, they were put to death, usually through being buried alive. Their writings were burned. Fortunately, most of those writings were saved, the writings of Confucius and Mencius, and so these would become what we call the Chinese classic. The changes, right? The Spring and Autumn Annals, right? These are the great fundamental canon of Chinese literature. During the Han Dynasty, which replaced the Qin Dynasty, which is, I think, arguably the greatest Chinese dynasty, it certainly is the most influential one in terms of the lasting nature of its influence. There's a reason that ethnic Chinese people call themselves Han. The Han Dynasty is comparable to the Roman Empire in terms of the Roman Empire shaping of the West. The Han Dynasty performed a similar role in Asia. The Han Dynasty would employ Confucianism as its philosophy of state, and this is to counter the harshness and the perceived inhumanity of the Qin Dynasty. Remember, with its system of very strict punishments. So the Confucianists the Han Dynasty emperors wanted to justify their rule through a humanitarian argument based on Confucian principles. So Confucianism became the official philosophy of state, and officials were promoted by the emperors based on their what was called humaneness or run, right? Which is a combination of learning, proper conduct, functional social relationships, and this is important. The filial piety is the most important aspect of this. The third aspect is service to the state. Confucian scholars were expected to serve the government, not to work in private industry. In fact, for Confucius, merchants were parasites. He looked at merchants as profiting off of the labor of farmers and craftsmen, whom he idealized over merchants. Merchants simply moved goods from one region to the other and obtained an exorbitant profit, exploiting the farmers and the workers. He was very much for a society that emphasized farming over every other aspect of life. And the reason for this is that the population was very large, even in antiquity in China. There was a strong emphasis by Confucian scholars on the moral requirement to feed everyone. So anything that took away from what they called primary occupations, which was farming, animal husbandry, fishing, obtaining food for the population, they looked at negatively. And they saw merchants as exploiting these farmers, taking advantage of them, and pushing them into poverty. So Confucius looked down on business in general, seeing it as beneath the dignity of a well-educated, humane person. And that leads into the last aspect of humaneness run, which was concern for the common people. You are not allowed to be a scholar official and amass wealth and power without concerning yourself with the welfare of the people. This would cause the dynasty to lose the mandate of heaven, and the people would ultimately revolt against you. Your duty was to the emperor, but the emperor had to be a loving father who looked after the people, because society was structured like a giant family. The family is the foundation of morality. It's the foundation for all human relationships, according to Confucius and those who came after him. So the emperor had to be like a grandfather, but he had to be a loving grandfather. He had to care for his grandchildren. He had to care for the people and the officials under him, whom they would often refer to as uncles, had to also look after the people. They had to make sure that the had enough to eat, that the land was orderly, that there wasn't violence and chaos, that the laws were being applied fairly. They weren't allowed to accumulate riches and power and lives of debauchery. If that happened, they would bring ruin to themselves and to the state, like King Jia did in the Xia dynasty when he had his concubine Moshe, and they went sailing on that lake of wine I told you about. I want to very quickly discuss the idea of filial piety in greater detail. This is the principal ethic on which Confucianism is based. It is the dominant moral code of Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese societies. This is the idea that you have to revere, obey, and take care of your elders. So your parents raise you, they provide you with education, they provide you with food, clothing, and shelter. You have an obligation to take care of them in their old age. For in this part of the world, a nursing home, certainly in the 1980s and 90s when they first entered these societies as they began to age, the society, that means the proportion of the society that is older has increased since the 1980s. Not that there weren't elder people in every era, but the nursing home was looked at almost like a concentration camp would be looked at in the West as an absolute abomination. You had an obligation to take care of your elders, to make sure that they were fed, that they were comfortable, and not only that, they felt loved and appreciated in their old age because they had labored for you for a lifetime. So you had an obligation to pay them back. And of course, as a child, you grow up being obedient to your parents, having reverence for your parents, and sometimes this can result in conflict. It's very harmonious in terms of everyone knowing his or her role. At the same time, you can end up with situations where the older generation will have a great amount of power over the younger generation. And we'll give the example of a traditional Chinese marriage in the Confucianist system, in which a young man's mother will kind of dictator of his young wife, right? She has to serve. The stereotype is that the old grandfather is easy to please, right? That he's happy getting, and right, he's content in his old age, while the in-law is constantly throwing out instructions and down her daughter-in-law and criticizing her and criticizing the way she parents the grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The stereotype, but at the same time, this is a society where the family is emphasized over the individual. Your family name comes before your given name. And legally, you belong, in the traditional imperial period, you belong to families. Families punish for crimes, not individuals. So this is a critical part of the Confucianist ideology, because it was believed that Without this kind of tight-knit family structure in which the elders had power over the younger members of the family, you would have chaos. You would have moral chaos. You would have violence. And of course, there's something to be said for that. Statistically speaking, this part of the world has the least amount of crime of any part of the globe. So that something to be said for this structure in which young people are taught to obey their elders. Also, educational attainment is very, very high in this part of the world. The Confucianists emphasized education since antiquity. Becoming educated is part of obeying and honoring your parents. So it's not surprising that school aptitude is very, very high in this part of the globe. So there's good and bad to this concept of filial piety, of Confucian teaching, just like with every other system. No system on earth is perfect. And as we'll see in traditional Chinese society, there were many, many, many triumphs, many, many. And just keep this in mind as we go through the course, that this is the primary ethic shaping how people are looking at the world. In fact, I'm going to include a supplemental video about filial piety so that it can point home further. The last point I want to make regarding Confucianism is that this is the means through which bureaucrats were trained. The traditional Chinese empire was not administered by knights or great nobles or fighting men. The empire was administered by scholar officials. We'll use that term, scholar officials. They're also called mandarins in the 19th century by Westerners. That's why we have the term Mandarin Chinese, right? The form of Chinese used by scholar officials, right? By government bureaucrats. So these bureaucrats were chosen to help the emperor rule, in part based on their scholastic performance. They would take, once they had reached the age of 18, they would take an examination in a very isolated environment where they would essentially have a 3-day essay question test from hell that they had been preparing for years and years and years. And their performance on this giant essay question test would determine their rank in the government, well, along with some other factors. One factor was their performance on this exam. Another factor was their recommendation for filial piety. So if you were very, very to your father, to your grandfather, mother, grandmother, to the elderly people in your local community, you were seen as having high moral character. And because you had high moral character, you would make a great official. You wouldn't defraud the government. You wouldn't cheat people. You would be compassionate towards peasants. So that filial piety, coupled with your performance on that's how you were promoted throughout the government. So if you did the best on the exam and you had a great reputation for filial piety, you would generally have your choice of ministerial appointments when you entered government service. And this would be a life service. So these scholar officials would form parties, political. They would try to influence the emperors. You had those who advocated for different platforms, taxing this product, organizing a province this way, reorganizing it that way, engaging in diplomacy with this foreign tribe, fighting this other foreign tribe. And so you had disputes and debates between these parties of scholar officials throughout the era. In fact, when we look at the debate on salt and iron, there are scholar officials who have a legalist bent and those who are staunch Confucianists called literati. And the legalists were somewhat Confucianists too in this period of time that we're talking about, the Han Dynasty. But there were those who were more sympathetic to the legalists, and they had a dispute over whether or not the government had the right to declare a monopoly on salt and iron, that the government had a right to monopolize the production of both products because the people depended on them. But generally, salt, iron, and liquor during this period of time, when we talk about the Han Dynasty, we'll talk more about this. There was an emperor who wanted to engage in a foreign war. To pay for that war, he declared that the government alone could produce salt, iron, and liquor. And these are three things that people depended on for survival. So the Confucianists, the literati, argued that this was very oppressive to the people. And those who had a more legalistic bent argued that the state's needs superseded the needs of the people. Okay, so I'm going to continue this discussion with a very long video on the Han Dynasty. So, okay, thank you. Thank you for listening.